The flashing red and blue lights of a county cruiser didn't just illuminate the gravel driveway, they cut through the thick morning mist like a pair of surgical lasers, signaling the death of a 3-generation homestead. For Arthur Vance, the sound of tires crunching on loose stone wasn't a surprise, but rather the final, exhausting echo of a year-long war against local bureaucracy. Sheriff Thomas Miller stepped out of the vehicle, a crisp, county-stamped eviction notice tucked firmly beneath his arm, flanked by 2 private moving trucks paid for by the highest bidder in the valley. Arthur stood on his porch, holding nothing but a faded blueprint and a cold cup of coffee, watching the machinery of small-town corruption prepare to tear his history down to the bedrock. The conflict had not begun with flashing lights, it had started with a quiet amendment to the county's commercial zoning bylaws 12 months earlier. The Blackwood Valley, once an isolated stretch of agricultural land, had recently caught the eye of Apex Logistics, a regional shipping conglomerate desperate to build a massive inland distribution hub. The only obstacle standing in the way of their multi-million-dollar highway corridor was Arthur's 40-acre parcel, a strategic bottleneck nestled perfectly between the state route and the western valley slope. When Arthur flatly refused a series of laughably low market purchase offers from Apex's shell companies, the local political machinery shifted into overdrive to accomplish through legal coercion what they could not achieve through fair trade. The county treasurer's office suddenly discovered a supposed historical tax discrepancy, claiming Arthur owed decades of back taxes due to a recalculated agricultural exemption boundary. It was a classic administrative squeeze play: fabricate an insurmountable debt, pass it through a cooperative local magistrate, and issue a summary foreclosure before the property owner can secure a federal appellate review. To the average citizen, the paperwork looked flawless, carrying the official seal of the municipality and the signature of a judge whose campaign finance records heavily featured real estate developers. Sheriff Miller, a man whose upcoming re-election campaign relied entirely on the economic promises of the Apex development, was more than happy to expedite the physical removal. As the moving crew began unloading crates onto the damp grass, the sheriff marched up the wooden steps, his boots thudding with the weight of absolute authority. He held out the document, refusing to meet Arthur's eyes, preferring instead to look over the older man's shoulder at the vintage farmhouse that had stood since the turn of the 20th century. "You've had 30 days to vacate the premises under Court Order 44A, Arthur," the sheriff announced, his voice carrying across the yard to ensure the movers heard his compliance with protocol. "The county has taken physical possession of the deed due to tax delinquency, and the land has been legally transferred to the Development Authority. You need to step aside." Arthur didn't yell, nor did he display the desperate panic the sheriff had anticipated based on dozens of previous rural evictions. Instead, he took a slow sip of his coffee, set the mug down on a rustic side table, and unrolled a wide, brittle sheet of heavy-grade drafting paper across the porch railing. "I've read your order, Thomas, and I've read the county charter that supposedly grants you the power to execute it," Arthur said softly, his voice cutting through the idling drone of the diesel trucks. "But you're operating under the assumption that this land falls under municipal jurisdiction, which means you skipped a very important step in your title search." The sheriff let out a short, dismissive laugh, tapping the badge pinned to his chest as if reminding a child of the hierarchy of power in the valley. "A court order is a court order, Arthur. If you think the county made an error in the tax assessment, you can argue that in front of a magistrate next month, but today, you're trespassing on corporate property, and my men are going to start clearing this house." He gestured to the movers, who stepped forward toward the porch, their hands resting on empty cardboard boxes. Arthur simply pointed down at the map, specifically to a bold, ink-faded line that ran parallel to the northern boundary of his acreage, cutting directly through the site where Apex Logistics intended to lay their primary asphalt access road. "This isn't an agricultural boundary dispute, Thomas. What you're looking at is a certified copy of the 1875 General Railroad Right-of-Way Act Charter, signed by the Federal Land Office long before this county even had a name." The sheriff paused, his hand freezing over the eviction papers as his gaze involuntarily dropped to the document on the railing. The map didn't feature the modern colorful lines of county zoning maps. It was a stark, meticulous topographical layout from the late 19th century, bearing the official stamp of the United States Department of the Interior. "I don't care about train history, Arthur," Miller muttered, though his tone lost a fraction of its aggressive certainty. "The railroad tore those tracks up back in the late 1950s, and the land reverted back to the state, which eventually zoned it for county management. "That's exactly what the developers told you to think," Arthur replied, a calm smile finally breaking through his weathered features. "They checked the state registry, but they forgot that some contracts are structurally impossible to dissolve from the bottom up. When the Atlantic and Western Railroad laid these tracks, they didn't just buy a right-of-way, they accepted a conditional federal land grant. And when my grandfather bought this property from the receivership in 1941, he didn't just buy the dirt, he bought the underlying federal deed patent. You brought a county eviction notice to a federal property fight, Sheriff, and your jurisdiction stops exactly where this line begins." The silence that settled over the porch was absolute, broken only by the steady, rhythmic ticking of the truck engines idling in the driveway. Sheriff Miller stared at the faded ink of the 1875 charter, his brow furrowing as he tried to find a familiar legal foothold on a document that predated his own department by nearly 30 years. He knew how to handle standard foreclosures, zoning violations, and local property disputes, but this map represented an entirely different legal ecosystem. The movers stood by their trucks, shifting their weight uncomfortably, sensing that the quick, routine eviction they had been paid to execute had just hit a massive, bureaucratic roadblock. Arthur watched the sheriff's confidence begin to fracture, remembering the months of exhausting research that had led him to this exact moment. When the county first issued the fabricated tax assessment, Arthur hadn't panicked. He had gone down to the basement of his farmhouse, where 3 generations of family records were stored in heavy, galvanized tin boxes. His grandfather, a meticulous Scotsman named Duncan Vance, had been an engineer for the Atlantic and Western Railroad before purchasing the homestead. Duncan understood that in the American West, land was more than just dirt, it was a complex web of overlapping sovereign grants, corporate charters, and federal patents that could outlive any local government. Deep within those tin boxes, buried beneath old land surveys and family birth certificates, Arthur had uncovered the original 1883 property abstract. It wasn't a standard municipal deed, but a federal land patent, complete with a raised presidential seal. The document explicitly stated that the 40-acre parcel was subject to the General Railroad Right-of-Way Act of 1875. This specific act didn't just give the railroad permission to run tracks through the valley, it granted them a permanent, federal easement that could only be dissolved or reassigned by an act of Congress or a formal abandonment filing with the Federal Bureau of Land Management. The local developers at Apex Logistics, working hand in hand with the corrupt county treasurer, had made a fatal, arrogant assumption. They saw that the physical tracks had been pulled up in 1958 and assumed the land had automatically reverted to the state's public domain, making it vulnerable to municipal zoning manipulation. They failed to realize that the Atlantic and Western Railroad had gone bankrupt, and its assets, including the underlying federal land patent, had been sold to private buyers under strict federal receivership rules. When Arthur's grandfather bought the land, he didn't just buy the agricultural rights, he bought the absolute fee-simple title to the railroad's right-of-way, effectively making him the custodian of a federal transit corridor. "This doesn't change anything on the ground today, Arthur," Sheriff Miller said, his voice dropping into a low, threatening register as he tried to regain control of the situation. "The county court signed off on this tax foreclosure. If you think there's a federal issue here, you should have filed an injunction in a federal district court before today. My orders are to clear this house, and until a judge tells me otherwise, that's exactly what I'm going to do." He stepped toward the door, reaching for the screen handle. Arthur didn't move an inch to block him. Instead, he reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a single sheet of clean, white paper, a sharp contrast to the yellowed map on the railing. It was a formal notice of federal jurisdictional dispute, stamped and filed less than 24 hours earlier with the regional office of the Bureau of Land Management and the United States District Court for the Western District. "I did file an injunction, Thomas," Arthur said calmly, handing the paper to the sheriff. "And because this land involves a federal statutory right-of-way, the moment that dispute was docketed, it triggered an automatic administrative stay. Under Title 28 of the United States Code, any local enforcement action regarding disputed federal patent land is immediately suspended until a federal magistrate reviews the chain of title. If you or those movers cross my threshold, or if a single piece of heavy machinery touches that dirt road, you aren't just committing a civil trespass. You are actively interfering with a protected federal transportation corridor, and that carries a mandatory federal felony charge. The sheriff's hand hovered centimeters from the door handle, his fingers twitching. He looked down at the fresh court stamp, recognizing the unmistakable seal of the United States District Court. The local magistrate who had signed the eviction notice was a powerful man in the county, but he was a nonentity compared to a federal district judge. Miller knew that if he proceeded with the eviction and Arthur's legal argument held up, the county wouldn't protect him. He would be left standing alone in front of a federal prosecutor, facing charges of violating civil rights under color of law. The movers, seeing the sheriff hesitate over a piece of paper, began walking back toward their cabs. They were local guys, and they had no intention of getting caught in the crossfire of a federal lawsuit just to help a billionaire logistics company build a parking lot. The legal landscape of the valley had shifted in a matter of seconds, transforming a simple local land grab into a high-stakes jurisdictional standoff that the county was utterly unprepared to fight. The morning sun finally broke through the tree line, casting long, sharp shadows across the gravel where the moving trucks were now loudly shifting into reverse. The drivers didn't need to hear another word. The sudden change in the sheriff's posture told them everything they needed to know. Sheriff Miller stood alone on the porch steps, staring at the federal docket number printed at the top of Arthur's notice. His phone began to vibrate violently in his pocket, the screen displaying the name of Marcus Vance, no relation to Arthur, but rather the senior managing partner of the development group backing Apex Logistics. Miller stepped away from the porch, his boots crunching loudly as he walked toward the hood of his cruiser to take the call. Arthur remained by the railing, rolling up his grandfather's 1883 map with deliberate precision, knowing that while he had won the opening skirmish, the real war was about to escalate. Over the speaker of the sheriff's radio, Arthur could faintly hear Marcus Vance's sharp, demanding voice asking why the demolition crews hadn't been cleared to enter the northern boundary of the property. "Marcus, we've got a massive problem down here," Miller muttered, keeping his back to Arthur as he spoke into his phone. "Old man Vance just served me with a certified federal stay from the district court. He's got an 1875 railroad right-of-way charter that explicitly covers the exact transit corridor your engineers mapped out for the main access highway. He's claiming federal jurisdiction over the title." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, followed by a torrent of angry, rapid-fire instructions. Marcus Vance wasn't a man accustomed to losing, especially not to an isolated farmer whose entire net worth was tied up in 40 acres of dirt. The developers had already invested over $5 million in purchasing surrounding parcels, securing state highway permits, and grading the land just north of Arthur's fence line. Every day the project was delayed cost the conglomerate tens of thousands of dollars in equipment rentals and contractual penalties with their civil engineering firms. "I don't care if he has a deed signed by Abraham Lincoln himself." Vance barked loud enough for Arthur to hear clearly across the yard. "The railroad hasn't run a train through that valley in 70 years, Miller. That easement is legally dead under the state's abandoned property statutes. Tell him to take his paperwork to the County Board of Appeals next month, and get him off that porch right now." "It's not a state easement, Marcus," Miller replied, his voice laced with uncharacteristic frustration. "That's the catch. It's a federal land patent grant. My department's legal counsel warned me last year that if anyone ever dug up one of these old railroad charters, the state laws wouldn't apply. If I cross that line to enforce a local tax lien while a federal administrative stay is active, I can be personally sued for civil rights violations without municipal immunity. I'm pulling my men back until the county attorney reviews the filing." Without waiting for the developer's furious response, Miller slammed his phone shut and walked back to the porch steps. He looked up at Arthur, his expression a mix of anger and reluctant respect. "You think you're pretty smart, don't you, Arthur? You think a piece of paper from the 19th century is going to stop a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure project that has the backing of the entire state government?" "It's not about being smart, Thomas," Arthur said, securing the rolled-up map with a sturdy rubber band. "It's about knowing the law. When the United States government granted these right-of-ways to the railroad companies to settle the frontier, they wrote the legislation with teeth. They wanted to ensure that no local municipality or state government could ever cut off the national transit arteries. That's why federal railroad deeds don't expire just because the steel tracks are gone. The easement remains a permanent federal corridor until Congress explicitly passes a bill to dissolve it or the Bureau of Land Management reclaims it for public use. Apex Logistics didn't do their homework, and now they're trying to build a private highway on a federal highway. As the sheriff climbed back into his cruiser and backed down the driveway, a heavy silence returned to Dead End Road. But Arthur knew he couldn't sit still. The federal stay was only a temporary shield. It would hold for perhaps 48 hours before Apex's high-priced legal team filed an emergency motion to vacate the injunction in front of a federal magistrate. To cement his victory, Arthur needed to transform his defensive paperwork into an offensive legal strike. He walked into his house, picked up his truck keys, and drove straight toward the county courthouse, determined to place his historical documents directly into the public record before Apex could manipulate the local zoning maps any further. The drive to the county seat took less than 20 minutes, but for Arthur, every mile felt like a march toward a final confrontation. The landscape along the state route was already changing, scarred by heavy bulldozers and yellow excavators bearing the Apex Logistics logo. They were tearing through the old valley meadows, preparing to pour hundreds of tons of asphalt right up to his northern fence line. Arthur parked his weathered pickup truck in front of the stone courthouse, a building that had stood since 1912, its classic facade masking the corporate corruption that now ran rampant through its interior offices. Carrying the galvanized tin box containing his grandfather's original 1883 federal land patent, Arthur walked through the heavy glass doors and straight to the county recorder of deeds office. The clerk behind the counter, a woman named Clara who had worked for the county for 30 years, looked up with an expression of deep anxiety. News traveled fast in a small town, and she had clearly already received a frantic phone call from the county treasurer's office regarding the standoff at Dead End Road. "Arthur, I don't think you should be in here right now," Clara said in a hushed whisper, glancing toward the glass office at the back of the room where the county registrar was currently deep in discussion with two men in expensive, tailored suits. One of those men was Marcus Vance, the managing partner of Apex Logistics. "I have a legal right to file a certified property abstract, Clara," Arthur said firmly, placing the heavy tin box on the counter. "I'm here to officially record a federal land patent amendment to my existing property deed. It needs to be entered into the public ledger immediately, before the county attempts to finalize the tax foreclosure sale to Apex." Before Clara could touch the documents, the door to the inner office swung open, and Marcus Vance stepped out, flanked by the county registrar, a man named Donald Croft, who owed his entire political career to Apex's campaign donations. Vance looked at Arthur with a mixture of amusement and irritation, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt as if he were dealing with a minor administrative nuisance rather than a legitimate legal threat. "Mr. Vance," Marcus said, his voice dripping with condescension as he approached the counter. "The sheriff told me about your little stunt this morning with the Bureau of Land Management paperwork. It's a very clever stalling tactic, I'll give you that. But your understanding of property law is entirely outdated. The 1875 Railroad Right-of-Way Act was superseded by the Railroad Revitalization and Regulatory Reform Act of 1976. When the Atlantic and Western Line was officially abandoned in the 50s, the state took control of the corridor, and the county legally absorbed it when you failed to pay your recalculated property taxes. Your federal stay will be thrown out by a magistrate by tomorrow morning." Arthur didn't flinch. He opened the tin box, pulled out the certified 1883 abstract, and unfolded it right over the modern county land ledger on the counter. "You're half right, Marcus," Arthur replied calmly. "The 1976 Act did change how future rail abandonments are handled, but it explicitly protected pre-existing vested rights under federal patents issued prior to 1920. My grandfather didn't just inherit an easement, he purchased the absolute fee-simple title to the underlying land grant from a federal bankruptcy receiver. The railroad company owned the dirt entirely, under a congressional grant that carries a perpetual reversionary clause to the patent holder, not the state, and certainly not the county." Donald Croft, the county registrar, stepped forward, his face flush with anger. "This office refuses to record this document, Arthur. The tax foreclosure has already been processed by the magistrate, and the title is currently held by the County Development Authority. You have no legal standing to alter the deed record at this point. If you refuse to record a certified federal land patent, Donald, you are committing a direct violation of federal recording statutes under Title 43 of the United States Code, Arthur said, his voice ringing clearly through the quiet office so that the other clerks could hear every word. And more importantly, your buddy the sheriff made a massive miscalculation this morning. When he drove his county cruiser across my northern boundary to serve that foreclosure notice, he didn't just cross my property line. He crossed into an active federal transit corridor that is currently under review by the Department of the Interior. By attempting to execute a local municipal order on federal patent land, he committed a jurisdictional trespass. I've already uploaded the cruiser's dashcam footage, which my security cameras captured, to the federal district court's electronic filing system. Marcus Vance's smile finally vanished. He looked at the county registrar, whose anger was rapidly transforming into visible panic. They had spent a year setting up a flawless local legal trap, using fabricated tax debts and cooperative local judges to steal Arthur's land without a fight. They had assumed Arthur was just another uneducated rural landowner who would break under the pressure of a sheriff's eviction. They never expected him to possess a pristine paper trail that bypassed the entire state court system, linking his 40 acres directly to the supreme law of the United States government. The silence inside the county recorder's office was heavy, broken only by the hum of the overhead fluorescent lights. Donald Croft looked down at the 1883 document, his hand trembling slightly as the full weight of Arthur's legal maneuver settled into the room. Marcus Vance, however, wasn't ready to concede. He leaned over the counter, his eyes narrowing as he glared at the weathered farmer who had just disrupted his multi-million-dollar logistics empire. You think a handful of statutes from a century ago can stop a state-backed infrastructure initiative, Arthur? Vance whispered, his voice sharp with venom. We have the political capital. We have the governor's economic development task force behind us. By tomorrow noon, our attorneys will have a federal judge dissolve your administrative stay, and those bulldozers will tear through your fence line whether you like it or not. Then I suggest you call your attorneys right now, Marcus, Arthur replied with absolute composure. Because while you were talking, the United States District Court just updated its public electronic portal. The federal magistrate didn't dismiss my stay. He reviewed the chain of title, recognized the validity of the 1883 federal land patent, and issued an emergency order to show cause against both Apex Logistics and the county sheriff's department. Arthur pulled out his tablet from his leather satchel, turning the screen around so both men could see the freshly issued federal order. The text was clear, carrying the unmistakable authority of a lifetime appointed federal judge. The document ordered an immediate, absolute cessation of all construction, grading, and clearing activities within 500 yards of the disputed right-of-way corridor pending a full evidentiary hearing on the sovereign patent rights. Furthermore, it explicitly warned that any violation of the order would result in immediate federal contempt charges, carrying mandatory jail time and severe financial penalties that no municipal insurance policy could cover. Vance snatched his phone out of his pocket, his face turning an ashen gray as he saw 3 missed calls from his lead corporate counsel. He stepped away from the counter, his voice rising into a panicked hiss as he answered the call. Tell me this is a joke, Vance demanded into the receiver. He listened in silence for 30 seconds, his jaw tightening as his attorney explained that the federal injunction was rock solid. Because the land was tied to a historical congressional railroad grant, the local tax foreclosure was legally void ab initio, meaning it was invalid from the very beginning. The county had no right to assess taxes on a federal transportation corridor, let alone seize it for private redevelopment. Donald Croft sank back into his office chair, completely abandoning his arrogant posture. He knew what a federal investigation into municipal land fraud meant. The fabricated tax discrepancies, the rushed magistrate orders, and the backroom deals with Apex Logistics would all be dragged into the blinding light of a federal courtroom. Under the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, the county officials who signed off on the sham foreclosure could face decades in a federal penitentiary for using mail and wire systems to execute a fraudulent property seizure. Clara, Arthur said softly, turning back to the stunned clerk behind the counter. Please record the federal land patent amendment. I believe the registrar is no longer objecting. Clara looked at Croft, who simply gave a weak, defeated nod. With a few clicks of her keyboard, the 1883 abstract was officially scanned, digitized, and permanently linked to the modern parcel registry of the county. The historic railroad deed was no longer a forgotten ghost in a galvanized tin box, it was now an insurmountable legal fortress protecting Arthur's homestead from corporate overreach. 2 hours later, Arthur stood back on the porch of his farmhouse on Dead End Road. The afternoon sun washed over the valley, illuminating a scene of profound quiet. The heavy excavators and bulldozers that had been idling menacingly along his northern border were being loaded back onto flatbed trailers. The construction crews, acting under strict orders from Apex's terrified legal department, were retreating from the property line as fast as their engines could carry them. Sheriff Miller's cruiser pulled slowly up the driveway once again, but this time, there were no flashing red and blue lights. The sheriff stepped out of the vehicle, looking exhausted and thoroughly defeated. He walked up to the porch steps, stopping well short of the threshold, his hands resting empty at his sides. "The county attorney just called me, Arthur," Miller said, his voice quiet, stripped of all the administrative authority he had brandished that morning. "The foreclosure warrant has been officially withdrawn. The county board is issuing a formal apology and a full cancellation of the alleged tax debt. I wanted to come down here personally and tell you that my department won't be returning to your land." Arthur looked out over his acreage, watching the last of the Apex logistics trucks disappear over the horizon. The valley was safe. His family's history, preserved through the meticulous record-keeping of his grandfather and the absolute supremacy of federal land law, remained unbroken. "Thank you for the update, Thomas," Arthur said, taking a slow sip from a fresh cup of coffee. "Just make sure your men remember where the county jurisdiction ends, and where the railroad right-of-way begins."